The morning sun cast long shadows across Nellie's Air Force Base as Valentina Kozlov stepped out of her matte black Bugatti Chiron, designer sunglasses reflecting the Nevada desert heat. The mechanics paused their work, exchanging glances and barely concealed smirks. Another rich kid playing soldier, they thought. Her perfectly manicured nails and $1,000 boots seemed to confirm every stereotype about trust fund bobbies buying their way into military contractor positions. "Ma'am, you'll need to check in at the range office," Sergeant Rodriguez called out, his tone professionally neutral but his eyes betraying amusement. "They're expecting the new civilian flight instructor." Valentina nodded silently, her movements precise and economical despite the theatrical entrance. The whispers followed her across the tarmac like contrails in a clear sky. Word had already spread through the base grapevine. Kozlov Industries had secured another lucrative defense contract, and the heiress herself was here to oversee pilot training protocols. The kind of nepotism that made career military personnel grind their teeth. What they didn't know was that the woman walking toward the briefing room had a ghost in her past. A call sign buried so deep in classified archives that even the Pentagon computers required triple authentication to access her service record. The manicured exterior was armor, carefully constructed over 7 years of civilian life. But underneath, muscle memory remained sharp as a blade. Colonel Marcus Webb, base commander, watched from his office window as she approached. He'd received the classified briefing packet 3 days ago. His hands had actually trembled as he read the redacted documents, cross-referencing dates and mission codes that most people weren't cleared to know existed. The woman currently causing a stir among his personnel wasn't just some billionaire's daughter playing dress-up. She was Nightfall, the most lethal female pilot in modern warfare history. 37 confirmed air-to-air kills across 3 theaters of operation. The ghost who'd single-handedly dismantled an entire enemy squadron over the Strait of Hormuz in 2017, then vanished from active duty without explanation. Her service record was a masterclass in precision lethality, each mission report reading like something from a Tom Clancy novel. Webb closed the file, his coffee growing cold as he processed the implications. Washington had sent him a legend disguised as a contractor. The question wasn't whether his pilots would respect her expertise. It was whether they could handle learning from someone whose kill count made their combined experience look like flight school. The real training was about to begin, and none of them were prepared for what Valentina Kozlov could teach them about death from above. Lieutenant Jake "Hotshot" Morrison was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. Lounging against his F-16's wing, he watched Valentina's approach with the casual arrogance that came naturally to Top Gun graduates. His squadron had dominated the last 3 red flag exercises, and he wasn't about to let some civilian consultant undermine their reputation. "Check out Princess Moneybags," he muttered to his wingman, Captain Alex Viper Chen. "Bet she's never even seen combat, let alone flown in it. Probably thinks warfare is like her daddy's flight simulator." The other pilots gathered around, their morning briefing forgotten as entertainment arrived. They'd all heard the rumors about Kozlov Industries' new military consultancy division. Defense contractors throwing money at problems they didn't understand, hearing pretty faces to justify inflated budgets. It was everything wrong with modern warfare, politics and profit margins trumping genuine expertise. Valentina entered the briefing room with measured steps, her heels clicking against polished concrete. She set down a worn leather flight bag, the only item that seemed out of place with her designer ensemble. The bag bore faded squadron patches and maintenance stickers, suggesting stories that didn't match her billionaire heiress image. "Good morning," she said simply, her voice carrying a slight accent that the pilots couldn't quite place. Eastern European, maybe Russian. Great, Morrison thought, another foreign consultant cashing in on American military spending. "I understand you have questions about the new training protocols." "Yeah, I've got a question." Morrison stood, his chest puffed with manufactured confidence. "What makes you think you can teach us anything about air combat? Your Wikipedia page says you studied economics at Harvard, not aeronautical warfare." A ripple of laughter swept through the room. Valentina's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her dark eyes. A flicker of recognition, like a wolf hearing its pack howl in the distance. She'd played this game before, in different briefing rooms with different faces wearing the same skeptical expressions. "Wikipedia," she repeated softly, almost to herself. Then louder, "Captain Morrison, isn't it? Top graduate of your class, 1,700 flight hours, 2 tour over Afghanistan." She paused, letting the accuracy of her knowledge sink in. "Tell me, what was your longest engagement time during Operation Resolute Support?" Morrison's smirk faltered. The specificity of her question caught him off guard, suggesting access to classified mission reports. 4 minutes, 30 seconds, but I don't see how that's. 4 minutes, 30 seconds to eliminate 2 Taliban positions using precision-guided munitions. Valentina walked closer, her heels now silent on the concrete. "Ground support mission. No air-to-air contact. No enemy fighters challenging your airspace dominance." The room had gone quiet. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. "My longest engagement lasted 14 seconds, she continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. 6 enemy aircraft, all destroyed before any of them could achieve missile lock. Would you like to know how?" Morrison's face had drained of color. The other pilots exchanged uncertain glances, suddenly aware that they'd misjudged something fundamental about their new instructor. Colonel Webb watched the confrontation unfold through the briefing room's one-way glass, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. He'd hoped to avoid this exact scenario, his hotshot pilots challenging someone whose credentials they couldn't begin to comprehend. The classified file in his safe painted a picture of lethality that would give these youngsters nightmares if they knew the truth. Valentina hadn't moved from her position near Morrison, but somehow her presence seemed to fill the entire room. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, the billionaire heiress facade melting away like morning frost under desert sun. What remained was something harder, more dangerous. A predator wearing designer clothes. "September 15th, 2017, she said, her accent more pronounced now, each word precisely enunciated. "Strait of Hormuz. 6 Iranian F-4 Phantoms attempting to intercept a reconnaissance flight. Weather conditions: scattered clouds at 15,000 feet, crosswind at 22 knots. Morrison's hands had begun to shake almost imperceptibly. The date rang a bell, a half-remembered intelligence briefing about a failed Iranian interception that had become legend among aviators. But the official reports were classified beyond their clearance level. The Iranian lead pilot was Captain Haddad Rostami, 12 years experience, veteran of the Iran-Iraq War. His wingmen were good, disciplined formation flying, proper radio discipline, textbook approach vectors. Valentina's eyes had taken on a distant quality, as if she was seeing through time itself. "They never saw me coming." She moved to the tactical display board, her manicured fingers tracing flight paths with muscle memory precision. "Approach from below, sun at my 6 o'clock. First pair eliminated with AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles at maximum range. Target lock acquired and fired before they could react. Second pair broke formation, standard evasive maneuvers but predictable. Third pair tried to run." The room was dead silent now. Even the maintenance crews visible through the windows had stopped their work, as if sensing the electricity in the air. "Rostami was the last to die," she continued, her voice eerily calm. "He managed to turn toward me, probably thought he could get a shot. I waited until he could see my aircraft clearly before firing. Professional courtesy, every pilot deserves to know who beat them." Captain Chen found his voice first, barely a whisper. "You were flying with call sign Nightfall." Valentina turned from the display board. and for a moment the pilots saw something that chilled them to the bone. Not anger or frustration at their earlier mockery, but the cold, analytical gaze of someone who had killed 37 human beings in aerial combat and slept soundly afterward. "That's Colonel Nightfall to you, Captain," she said simply. "Now, shall we discuss the new training protocols, or would you prefer to continue questioning my qualifications?" The silence stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Morrison felt his world tilting on its axis as the implications crashed over him in waves. Nightfall wasn't just a legend whispered about in pilot bars. She was standing 3 feet away, studying his squadron with the same clinical precision she'd once used to hunt enemy aircraft. "Jesus Christ," Viper Chen breathed, his face pale as Nevada sand. "You're actually her, the ghost pilot, the one who disappeared after Operation Crimson Sky." Valentina's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes at the mention of that operation. A shadow of old pain, quickly suppressed. "Operation Crimson Sky is still classified, Captain. I suggest you forget you ever heard that name." But Morrison's mind was racing, pieces clicking together like a complex puzzle. The sudden retirement of the military's most successful fighter pilot, the emergence of Kozlov Industries' Defense Consulting Division. The timing aligned perfectly, though the transformation from warrior to billionaire still seemed impossible. "Why?" Morrison asked, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. "Why leave? You were the best we had." The question hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft. Valentina walked to the window overlooking the flight line, her reflection ghost-like against the glass. Outside, F-16s and F-22s sat in perfect rows, ready for another day of training exercises that suddenly seemed like child's play. "Because I got tired of killing people, Lieutenant," she said finally, her voice carrying weights that none of them could fully understand. 37 confirmed kills sounds impressive in a briefing room. It's less romantic when you remember that each number represents someone's son, father, brother. Someone who woke up that morning thinking they'd see another sunset. The pilots shifted uncomfortably. They'd all taken lives in combat, but mostly through precision strikes against ground targets, surgical removals of threats from sanitized distances. Air-to-air combat was different, more personal, more immediate, looking another pilot in the eye through a canopy before pulling the trigger. "So you became a billionaire instead?" Morrison's question carried no mockery now, only genuine confusion. "I became whatever I needed to become to find purpose beyond killing." Valentina turned back to face them, and they saw something unexpected in her expression, vulnerability beneath the armor. Kozlov Industries develops technologies that save lives, medical devices, disaster response equipment, communication systems that help coordinate humanitarian aid. Every dollar we make in defense contracts funds $3 in life-saving research. She gestured toward the tactical display. But sometimes the world needs people who understand warfare to teach others how to avoid it, or how to end it quickly when avoidance isn't possible. That's why I'm here. The transformation in the room was palpable. Where minutes earlier there had been skepticism and mockery, now there was something approaching reverence. These were men who worshipped skill and respected lethality, and they were looking at someone who had perfected both. "What do you need us to do, ma'am?" Morrison asked, the formality feeling natural for the first time since she'd entered the room. Colonel Webb chose that moment to enter the briefing room, his timing precise as a surgical strike. He'd monitored the entire confrontation, watching his pilot's attitude shift from dismissal to recognition to something approaching awe. The transformation had been necessary but painful, another group of young warriors learning that legends sometimes walked among them in disguise. "Gentlemen," Webb announced, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk, "I believe proper introductions are in order. You've just met Colonel Valentina Kozlov, call sign Nightfall, formerly of the 65th Aggressor Squadron. She holds the Distinguished Flying Cross with 3 oak leaf clusters. the Air Medal with 17 clusters, and decorations from 6 allied nations I'm not authorized to name. The pilots stood straighter, their earlier casual postures abandoned in favor of military bearing. Morrison looked like he wanted to disappear into the concrete floor, his face burning with embarrassment at his earlier comments. "Ma'am," Webb continued, addressing Valentina with the respect her rank deserved, "your security clearance has been temporarily reactivated for this training cycle. The pilots under your instruction have been cleared for classified tactical scenarios up to secret level." Valentina nodded, the acknowledgement carrying weight that only career military personnel could fully appreciate. Clearance levels weren't just bureaucratic designations. They were markers of trust, indicators of how much faith the nation placed in your judgment and discretion. "Thank you, Colonel. I assume the scenario packages have been updated to reflect current threat assessments." "Affirmative. The Chinese J-20 stealth fighter parameters were integrated last week. Russian S-400 missile system data is current as of yesterday. We're also running simulations based on the Iranian drone swarm tactics observed in the Gulf last month." The casual discussion of cutting-edge threats sent a chill through the younger pilots. These weren't theoretical exercises. They were preparation for conflicts that might erupt at any moment. Wars that could begin with a single miscalculation or diplomatic failure. Valentina moved to the head of the briefing table, her transformation from billionaire heiress to military commander now complete. The designer clothes remained, but they no longer seemed like costume pieces. Instead, they became part of a more complex picture, a warrior who had chosen to fight different battles with different weapons. "The next 6 weeks will challenge everything you think you know about air combat," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived encounters that killed lesser pilots. "We'll be using advanced simulation technology that replicates combat stress more accurately than anything you've experienced. G-forces, hypoxia, target saturation scenarios that will push you beyond your current limits." She paused, studying each face in turn. "Some of you will wash out. This isn't a reflection of your skill or dedication. It's simply recognition that certain types of warfare require specific psychological profiles. There's no shame in discovering your limits." Morrison raised his hand hesitantly. "Ma'am, what's the objective? What are we training for specifically?" The question everyone had been thinking but afraid to voice. Valentina exchanged a glance with Colonel Webb, some silent communication passing between them. "Near-peer conflict," she said simply, and the room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Near-peer conflict, the euphemism that kept Pentagon analysts awake at night and sent chills through seasoned military personnel. Not the asymmetric warfare they'd grown accustomed to in Iraq and Afghanistan, but the possibility of facing an enemy with equivalent technology, training, and resources. China, Russia, nations that could challenge American air superiority for the first time since World War II. Captain Chen, who had remained silent since his earlier recognition of Nightfall's identity, finally found his voice. "Ma'am, permission to speak freely." Valentina nodded, her expression indicating that she expected, even welcomed, difficult questions from her new students. "The scuttlebutt says that Chinese J-20s have been probing Taiwanese airspace more frequently. Russian Tu-95 Bears are testing our response times in Alaska. Are we looking at the possibility of actual engagement in the near future?" It was a question that cut straight to the heart of every military pilot's deepest concerns. They'd all signed up to defend their country, but the reality of facing an enemy that could shoot back with equivalent lethality was something else entirely. Valentina was quiet for a long moment, weighing her response carefully. Classification levels were tricky things. Too much information could compromise operations. Too little could leave pilots unprepared for the realities they might face. "What I can tell you is this," she said finally. The luxury of fighting technologically inferior enemies is ending. The next major conflict will be fought between forces with similar capabilities, similar training, and similar determination. Victory will come down to tactics, adaptability, and the ability to make life-or-death decisions in milliseconds. She moved to the tactical display and brought up a map of the South China Sea, red and blue symbols marking various military installations and patrol routes. The Chinese have developed tactics specifically designed to counter American air power. Their pilots train in scenarios where they assume numerical and technological parity with us. They're not planning to win through superior equipment. They're planning to win through superior strategy. The pilots studied the display with growing unease. The comfortable assumption of American air dominance, the bedrock of their tactical doctrine, was being systematically eroded before their eyes. Russian pilots have been training in similar scenarios, Valentina continued, switching the display to show the Baltic Sea region. They've studied our interventions in Iraq, Libya, and Syria. They know our preferred tactics, our standard operating procedures, our logistical requirements. They've had 20 years to develop countermeasures. Morrison leaned forward, his earlier embarrassment replaced by professional concern. So what's the answer? How do we maintain our edge? By abandoning the assumption that we have an edge, Valentina replied without hesitation. By training as if we're the underdog. By developing tactics that don't rely on technological superiority or numerical advantage. By learning to think like our enemies while maintaining our own strategic principles. The briefing room had taken on the atmosphere of a war council, the morning's light-hearted mockery replaced by something far more serious. These pilots were beginning to understand that their new instructor hadn't come to teach them advanced techniques. She'd come to prepare them for a type of warfare that could begin without warning. Valentina's fingers danced across the tactical display's interface, bringing up a complex scenario that made the pilots' previous training exercises look like arcade games. Multiple enemy aircraft appeared on screen, their formation patterns and flight characteristics unlike anything they'd encountered in standard NATO combat doctrine. "This is a recreation of an engagement I flew over the Black Sea in 2018, she explained, her voice taking on the clinical tone of someone dissecting a chess game. Romanian airspace violation by 6 Russian Su-35. Official records show that 2 warning passes were made before the aircraft withdrew to international airspace." She paused, letting them study the tactical picture. The official records are incomplete. Colonel Webb shifted uncomfortably. Even he hadn't been fully briefed on some of Nightfall's more sensitive operations, missions that existed in the gray areas between diplomacy and warfare, where plausible deniability was more important than public recognition. "The Su-35 is a formidable aircraft," Valentina continued, highlighting one of the enemy symbols. "Twin-engine supermaneuverable fighter with thrust vectoring, advanced radar, and a combat load designed specifically to counter Western aircraft." The pilots were experienced, veteran instructors from the Russian Air Force Academy. They weren't probing our defenses, they were testing our resolve. Morrison studied the display intently. 6 versus 1, how did you? "I didn't engage all 6 simultaneously," Valentina interrupted. "That would have been suicide, regardless of skill level. Instead, I used geography, weather conditions, and their own tactical doctrine against them." She manipulated the display, showing the terrain features around the engagement zone. Mountains, valleys, cloud cover, environmental factors that most pilots considered obstacles rather than weapons. Russian doctrine emphasizes formation integrity and mutual support. They're trained never to break formation unless absolutely necessary. This discipline is usually a strength, but it can become a weakness if exploited correctly. The simulation began to play, showing aircraft movements in real time. The pilots watched in fascination as Nightfall's aircraft, a single F-22 Raptor, appeared to vanish from the display entirely. Stealth isn't invisibility, Valentina explained as her aircraft maneuvered through a mountain valley below radar coverage. It's the art of being undetectable when it matters most. The Russians knew I was out there somewhere, but they couldn't track me continuously. That uncertainty changed their behavior, made them cautious. Her aircraft reappeared on the display, climbing rapidly toward the Russian formation. But instead of attacking, the F-22 maintained a parallel course, staying just outside missile range. Psychological warfare, Captain Chen observed. You were making them nervous. Exactly. Combat stress affects decision-making. The longer they flew knowing an enemy was shadowing them, the more their formation discipline degraded. Small navigation errors, radio chatter, micro-adjustments to spacing and altitude. The simulation showed subtle changes in the Russian formation, tiny deviations that cascaded into larger tactical vulnerabilities. What had begun as a tight, professional formation gradually loosened as individual pilots made minor corrections to maintain visual contact with their wingmen. And then, Morrison prompted, leaning forward in his chair. Valentina's expression grew distant, as if she was seeing the engagement through the canopy glass again rather than on a tactical display. Then I killed them all. The simulation exploded into action. Nightfall's F-22 dove from the mountains like a hunting falcon, exploiting a momentary gap in the Russian formation with precision that bordered on supernatural. The first two Su-35s died before their pilots could react, victims of AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles launched from beyond visual range. Time to first kill, 14 seconds, Valentina narrated, her voice eerily calm as she watched her past self execute a perfect ambush. The lead aircraft never had a chance to warn his wingmen. Radio communication was jammed by terrain masking and my electronic warfare suite. The remaining 4 Russian aircraft scattered, their formation integrity collapsing as pilots instinctively maneuvered for survival. But their tactical doctrine, so effective in conventional engagements, had become a liability against an opponent who understood their training better than they did. This is where most pilots make their fatal mistake, Valentina continued, highlighting the diverging flight paths of the surviving aircraft. Panic leads to predictable behavior. Each pilot reverted to his individual training rather than maintaining unit cohesion. Morrison watched in horrified fascination as Nightfall's aircraft seemed to anticipate each evasive maneuver, positioning itself for killing shots with mathematical precision. How did you know which way they'd turn? Because I'd studied their training videos, Valentina replied matter-of-factly. Russian pilot schools are remarkably consistent in their instruction methods. When faced with a superior opponent, their doctrine calls for specific evasive patterns designed to maximize survival probability. Those patterns are predictable if you know what to look for. The third and fourth kills followed in rapid succession, both Su-35s falling to perfectly timed missile shots that caught them at the apex of their evasive turns, when their aircraft were most vulnerable to kinetic impact. 2 remaining, Captain Chen observed, his voice tight with tension despite knowing the outcome. The most dangerous 2, Valentina corrected. The survivors had witnessed their comrades die and were now fighting with nothing to lose. Desperation makes pilots unpredictable, willing to attempt maneuvers they'd never risk in training exercises. The simulation showed the final 2 Russian aircraft converging on Nightfall's position, their pilots apparently deciding that their only chance for survival lay in a coordinated attack. It was a sound tactical decision that might have worked against a less experienced opponent. But Nightfall wasn't less experienced. Vertical separation, Valentina explained as her aircraft suddenly climbed almost vertically, using the F-22's thrust vectoring and climb rate to escape the converging attack. Russian pilots are trained primarily for horizontal engagements. Their aircraft are capable of vertical maneuvers, but their tactical doctrine emphasizes staying in the optimal altitude band for their weapon systems. The final engagement was almost anticlimactic. As the two Su-35s struggled to adjust their attack vectors for the vertical threat, Nightfall dove back into the engagement envelope from above, her remaining missiles finding their targets with surgical precision. Total engagement time, 4 minutes, 17 seconds, Valentina announced as the simulation ended. 6 enemy aircraft destroyed with 0 friendly casualties. No international incident, no diplomatic protests, no media coverage. The briefing room was dead silent. The pilots had just watched a master class in aerial combat that redefined their understanding of what was possible in modern warfare. The silence stretched until Morrison finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Ma'am, how many engagements like that were there? Operations that never made it into the history books." Valentina's eyes grew distant, as if she was counting ghosts that haunted her memory. 17 classified missions between 2015 and 2019. Most were similar to what you just saw, surgical removals of threats that existed in the gray areas of international law. Pirates using military aircraft in the Gulf of Aden. Mercenary pilots flying for various African warlords. Drug cartels with surprisingly sophisticated air defenses. She paused, her fingers unconsciously tracing patterns on the briefing table that matched the tactical movements they just witnessed on screen. Each engagement was authorized at the highest levels of government. Each one was necessary to prevent larger conflicts, and each one added to a kill count that eventually became problematic. Colonel Webb cleared his throat gently. What Colonel Kozlov isn't telling you is that her mission success rate was 100%. 0 friendly losses under her command. 0 civilian casualties. 0 collateral damage incidents. The pilots exchanged glances loaded with new understanding. Perfect mission records weren't just impressive, they were nearly impossible in the chaos of real combat. The fact that Nightfall had achieved such consistency suggested a level of skill that bordered on the superhuman. "So why retire?" Captain Chen asked the question that had been building in everyone's mind. "If you were that successful, why walk away from active duty?" Valentina was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on something beyond the briefing room windows. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that made the young pilots understand they were glimpsing something deeply personal. "Because perfection in killing becomes its own prison," she said finally. "Every mission success raised the bar for the next operation. Higher risk targets, more complex scenarios, greater potential for catastrophic failure. I became the go-to solution for problems that couldn't be solved through conventional means." She turned to face them directly, and they saw something in her eyes that chilled them, not pride in her accomplishments, but a kind of weary acceptance of what she had become. "Do you know what it's like to be so good at ending lives that your own government becomes afraid to use anyone else? To receive mission briefings that begin with casualty estimates for your replacement pilots? To know that your retirement means other people will die attempting missions you could complete with minimal risk?" The question hung in the air like cordite smoke. These pilots had all experienced the weight of command responsibility, but nothing approaching the burden that Valentina described. "I didn't retire," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I transitioned, from ending lives to preserving them, from being a weapon to being a teacher, from winning wars to preventing them." Morrison shifted in his chair, processing implications that were larger than tactical doctrine or combat effectiveness. "And now you're back." "Now I'm back," she agreed, "because the world has changed. The luxury of surgical strikes and limited engagements is ending. The next war will be total, devastating, and fought by pilots who understand that survival depends on being willing to do whatever is necessary." The weight of her words settled over the briefing room like a shroud. These pilots had grown up in an era of American air superiority, so complete that enemy aircraft were rarely more than theoretical threats. The idea of facing opponents with equivalent training and technology was as foreign to them as ground combat would be to submarine crews. Valentina moved to a wall-mounted display showing current global military deployments, her fingers tracing patterns that revealed deeper strategic concerns than most of the pilots had ever considered. Red markers indicated Chinese military installations spreading across the South China Sea. Blue markers showed American bases, many of which were now within range of advanced enemy missile systems. "The mathematical reality is uncomfortable but undeniable," she said, her voice taking on the analytical tone of a chess master explaining a complex endgame. American military doctrine has been optimized for conflicts where we enjoy significant technological advantages. Our tactics, our training, our logistical systems, everything assumes that we can achieve air superiority quickly and maintain it throughout the conflict. She highlighted several conflict zones where that assumption had been challenged. Syria, where Russian air defense systems forced us to modify our operational patterns. The Persian Gulf, where Iranian anti-ship missiles created no-fly zones for carrier operations. Ukraine, where both sides achieved rough tactical parity through the use of advanced surface-to-air systems. Captain Chen studied the display with growing concern. "Ma'am, are you saying that our current training is inadequate for near-peer conflict?" "I'm saying that your current training is optimized for conflicts that may not exist in 5 years," Valentina replied bluntly. "The enemy has studied our methods, developed countermeasures, and trained their pilots specifically to exploit our tactical assumptions. They're not preparing to fight the America of 2001. They're preparing to fight the America of 2025. Morrison leaned forward, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by professional concern. "What specific changes are we talking about? What capabilities have they developed that we need to counter?" Valentina's expression grew grimmer as she pulled up classified intelligence summaries that painted a disturbing picture of evolving threats. Chinese stealth fighters with radar signatures comparable to our F-22s. Russian hypersonic missiles that can target our airfields faster than we can scramble interceptors. Iranian drone swarms that can overwhelm point defense systems through sheer numbers. The tactical implications were staggering. Every advantage that American pilots had taken for granted was being systematically eroded by enemies who had spent decades studying American methods and developing specific countermeasures. "But the most dangerous development isn't technological," Valentina continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "It's philosophical. Our potential enemies have abandoned the idea of fighting fair fights. They're preparing to win through asymmetric tactics, surprise attacks, and the willingness to accept casualties that American political leaders would find unacceptable." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "They're training their pilots to die for tactical advantage. Are you prepared to do the same?" The question struck the room like a physical blow. These pilots had all accepted the theoretical possibility of death in combat, but the reality of facing enemies with nothing to lose was something else entirely. Colonel Webb spoke into the silence, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made similar calculations in previous conflicts. "That's why you're here, Colonel Kozlov, to prepare them for realities that our current doctrine doesn't address." Valentina nodded grimly, her transformation from billionaire consultant to combat veteran now complete in the eyes of her students. The designer clothes and expensive accessories no longer seemed like disguises. They were simply the current uniform of someone who had learned to fight different types of battles. "The next 6 weeks will be unlike any training you've experienced," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "We'll be using simulation technology that replicates not just the mechanical aspects of combat, but the psychological pressures that determine victory or defeat in near-peer engagements. She gestured toward a door marked with biohazard and classification symbols that none of the pilots had noticed before. The Advanced Combat Simulation Chamber uses a combination of virtual reality, G-force simulation, and neurological feedback to create combat experiences that are indistinguishable from actual warfare. You'll face hypoxia, G-force-induced loss of consciousness, target saturation scenarios, and decision-making pressure that will test every assumption you have about your own capabilities. Morrison felt his mouth go dry. "Ma'am, what's the washout rate for this type of training?" "Historically, 60%, Valentina replied without hesitation. But those statistics were compiled using conventional training methods against theoretical opponents. What we're preparing for goes beyond historical precedent." She moved to another display showing pilot psychological profiles, stress response curves, and decision-making analysis that painted an uncomfortable picture of human limitations under extreme pressure. Combat effectiveness degrades rapidly when pilots are forced beyond their comfort zones. Tunnel vision, task saturation, decision paralysis, these are all normal responses to overwhelming tactical situations. Captain Chen studied the data with growing unease. How do we overcome those limitations? How do we maintain effectiveness in situations that exceed human capability? By expanding your definition of human capability, Valentina answered. By training until what seems impossible becomes routine. By developing tactical instincts that function even when conscious decision-making fails. She pulled up video footage from her own combat engagements, slowing the playback to highlight split-second decisions that had meant the difference between victory and death. This engagement over the Strait of Hormuz lasted 14 seconds. In that time, I had to identify 6 targets, calculate engagement priorities, coordinate missile launches, and begin evasive maneuvers for the inevitable counterattack. The pilots watched in fascination as the footage revealed tactical decisions happening faster than conscious thought. The human brain can't process that much information consciously. Success depends on training your subconscious mind to recognize patterns, assess threats, and execute responses automatically. Muscle memory, Morrison observed. Deeper than muscle memory, Valentina corrected. Combat intuition. The ability to know what your enemy will do before they know it themselves, to see tactical opportunities that exist for milliseconds, to make life-or-death decisions based on information your conscious mind hasn't even processed yet. She paused, studying each pilot's face in turn. Some of you have this potential, others don't. There's no shame in discovering your limitations. The shame comes from not pushing yourself to find out where those limitations are. The morning desert sun had climbed higher, casting harsh shadows that seemed to underscore the gravity of what these pilots were volunteering for. Valentina led them out of the briefing room toward the Advanced Combat Simulation Facility, her heels clicking against concrete with the rhythm of a funeral march. The simulation chamber was unlike anything they'd seen before. Banks of quantum computers hummed quietly behind reinforced glass, their cooling systems maintaining temperatures that allowed for processing power beyond conventional understanding. The pilot interface resembled a cross between a fighter cockpit and a medical examination chair, bristling with sensors designed to monitor everything from brain activity to stress hormone levels. Each simulation will be tailored to your individual psychological profile, Valentina explained as technicians made final preparations for the first session. The computer will identify your stress responses, decision-making patterns, and performance limitations, then design scenarios specifically to push you beyond those boundaries. Morrison approached one of the simulation chairs with the cautious respect usually reserved for unexploded ordnance. "Ma'am, is this technology classified? I've never seen anything like."